Welcome to Talk Design Podcast, the space where creativity meets conversation. I'm Adrian Ramsey, your host, and as someone deeply entrenched in the world of design, I'm thrilled to introduce you to the minds that inspire me in the hope that they will spark something special within you too. From a design past crafting women's swimwear to pushing the boundaries of performance sportswear, from mountaineering to international yachting, to implementing systematic innovation solutions that transcend boundaries in aerospace industry. My heart remains rooted in architecture, and exploring the emotional tapestry woven by built spaces is my fascination. My journey in design has been what can only be described as a life of design. I want to thank you for lending me your ears. I'm eager to embark on this next episode together. And for those of you who prefer to watch and listen, you can catch this episode at YouTube. That's youtube.com/@TalkDesignPodcast. My guest on Talk Design today is Andrew Barnes from Agent Architecture. Andrew is from Dallas, Texas, and he happens to be a friend of Michael Malone's, the fabulous Michael Malone, who has introduced us. We have just been having a little bit of a chat and just wandering through some pieces on community and how architecture responds to community. Anyway, we've got a fun chat coming up for you. Andrew, welcome to Talk Design.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
Hey, I would love to start out with pretty simple question. Why architecture? Of all the things that you could have done in life, what made you choose architecture? And when did you even discover it was something that existed? Like, what was the moment? Was there family? What was it?
Sure. I don't know. I feel like every architect probably has a similar story, but
You'd be surprised.
It's funny. So for what it's worth, as far back as I could remember, I have been obsessed with buildings and drawing floor plans in my little sketchbooks. And my mother would buy the little home floor plan catalogs at the grocery store checkout lane and just let me have at it. And I would just spend hours and hours looking through those, imagining being in all the little spaces, looking at how they arranged everything. And then I would draw my own versions. And, when I was like 7 or 8. And so it was really the only career I ever seriously considered. And my high school had a drafting program, so I did that for all 4 years and got familiar with the tools and three-dimensional thinking. And then when in-state school had a really highly ranked program, I was like, well, that's an easy decision. So not a whole lot of contemplation or thought. It was just like, well, that was the clear path.
How fascinating. And why was your mum buying those things for you? Did she already recognize it, or did she want another house?
Yeah, that's a great question. I guess I had expressed some interest. Otherwise,
she wanted another house.
I'll have to ask her. Yeah.
I wonder if what sparked it was you, or whether it was the dreaming of another space. And, everybody's project, whether it be, well, especially if it's residential, everybody's project comes from, a yearning to have something that's different or for themselves. And what kind of house did you grow up in as a kid?
Well, it's the house my parents are still in today. It's a split level home in the suburban Kansas City. So,
okay. Yeah, right.
I don't even know, like about 2,000 square feet, I'm guessing.
It's so interesting, eh? Like, in a home like that, it was split level? Was it architecturally designed, or would have it been catalog design? Or
yeah, it was definitely a builder home. The neighborhood, there's probably like 7 or 8 different home plans, and you can just sort of tell, like, oh, that one's our house, that one's our house, that one's our house. And I sort of took pride in that I could identify all of those, like, as we were driving through the neighborhood, and like, oh, that house is the same as like our friend's house, and that house is the same as these people's house. And so I sort of knew the different archetypes. I
was going to say, nothing like a bit of pattern matching.
Yeah.
Well, it's interesting in that sense, because they would have been built, all with similar materials, all those kinds of things, like, and the fact that your mind was playing, finding all the like pieces, which isn't so unusual that people who pattern match would do that. It's a great skill when you're a designer to be able to see patterns and understand the rhythm of them or get a sense of them. And I wonder if in that estate they built all the houses and sold them, or whether they were selling land and you could choose which house you put on it.
I think it's the first
Yeah.
choice, yes, where they're just like, we're building it all, and here's
Yep.
what we have for you. Come buy it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I remember when like as I said, years and years and years and years ago, I lived in Dallas, and I had never, I'm a Kiwi, so I'm New Zealand. I live in Australia now. However, I moved to, or ventured out to America pretty much as the first place I ever went to. So most New Zealanders travel to Australia first, and I went to Los Angeles first. And in going to Los Angeles first, I was just kind of in that great big, grubby town. Like, it's big, it's sprawling, doesn't really have a heart. There's little hearts everywhere. And I was like, wow, that was my first impression of America outside of television or movies. And then I ended up going from there back to New Zealand. So that was just actually a business trip. I was very young, and it was a business trip. Was one of the guy I worked for had said, okay, meet me here. And then the next trip was to Hawaii, and from Hawaii to Dallas. So I didn't see anything else in between. And my girlfriend's sister and brother-in-law were living in Dallas at the time. They were New Zealanders as well. And that was the first place I had ever seen a set of houses being built like that. Like, there was a subdivision being built. And I was absolutely fascinated by the fact that this whole thing was all of a similar palette, all of a similar set of roof lines, and they were all going to be ready, I reckon, within, I don't know, it looked like they were all going to be ready at the same time. They wouldn't have been, but it looked like that. And I'm going, so they're all the same, but they're not all the same. They're all very similar. And they were kind of explaining it to me, and I'm going, why does that happen? And the other thing that I thought was, who could afford to do that? How could that be afforded? Because everybody I knew was lucky if they owned their own home. Well, a lot of them did own their own home, but otherwise they just rented a house. And so it was this, how could somebody afford something on so much mass scale? And
which is interesting, because I feel like it's sort of, that's almost the only way America knows how to produce housing now, because I guess of the efficiencies of scale.
Yeah.
And just doing it at that. But that's so interesting to have come at it from that other perspective. And like, because you're right. I mean, it is super intensive to do it all at once, but I guess when they figure out the
money
profits that they could, get from the sale of each one, then it all worked out. But it is sort of the commodification of housing, and, just letting the pro forma impact the built environment, which that is probably the driver of the built environment now, but
it's really interesting how different places try to play with that. Take a place like Serenbe. It's down in the south, and I'm trying to think of what state it's in, but it's a farm-based community of homes, and so it's very organically based and stuff as well, and it's kind of a model. I should be looking it up while I'm talking, but I think you're going to be faster.
We'll see.
And I haven't been. However, it's on my list to go to, and it is that development of that kind of same idea, but in a much more organic way. And they hold a conference there every year on this kind of thinking as well. And I've got have you found it?
No, I'm returning 0 hits, so I'm not doing it.
Okay, let me just see if I can find it. I've got a job that's coming up, which is to design basically a community like this kind of community. And with it, it's, I don't know, 35 lots. And so it's in Fulton County in Georgia, and it's, for everybody listening, it is Serenbe, Serenbe, and it's a neighborhood focused on well-being, full of fresh food and fresh air, community set amongst acres of preserved forests and meadows. Yeah, there you go. But they have a lot of events, and they have a lot of events that push that kind of lifestyle, which is
Very
cool.
cool.
Yeah, very cool. And it's been on my list for quite a while as a place to visit, and just haven't made it there yet. Good friend of mine goes really often and just hires a house there and hangs out there. So anyway, yeah, that whole kind of thing of creating community is the other part of that. Like, as a kid and living in that place in Kansas, was there all families that were similar ages, or a lot of families that were similar ages? And did you all play, stickball or whatever it is in the street, and ride your bikes together and roam the
I think,
streets as gangs of kids? And like, what was it like?
I mean, there was a little bit of that, maybe not quite as much as the, like, I don't know, 1950s sort of stereotype
Yeah.
of that. But I mean, yeah, there were plenty of young families with kids my age, and yeah, rode the bike around and was able to walk to my elementary school, which I guess was the thing that you take for granted, but I feel like now that's not
Nobody
as common
walks.
for kids. So yeah, it was great. And I mean, in the suburban environment, even growing up like further along in high school, me and my buddies, we just sort of like wander throughout the
Yeah.
city, and like, oh, this drainage ditch looks interesting. Like, where does it go? Just
Big crawling up
stuff like that.
pipes, and yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So it was, we made the most of it, I guess. But
Do you know, it's interesting that as well. Like, I was talking to, I don't know whether you know, Australian architect Peter Stutchbury, but anyway, one of Australia's sort of, I would say, maybe not most famous, but certainly most respected architects. And he was saying, when he was a kid, of course, nobody knew what he was doing. And I was the same. There was no phones, there was no observation. You know, you only got found out if you got caught, or if something went wrong. Like you're saying, where's this drainage ditch go? All this discovery. And now everything like that is monitored or kind of off limits. And then there's less, I want to say, radical thinking, because that's what Peter was saying. There's less, the adventure is more curated. Your kids are more likely to go down to a gentrified neighborhood and eat donuts and have their nails done, or, meet at the soda shop or whatever it is, than they ever were before, where there was that space to roam and that space to go and discover, whether it be a cityscape or whether it be a landscape, a countryside. And then it's funny how we create community wherever we are. Like, or we look to create community wherever we are. And that, I want to ask you about that when we talk about your skeletal tower. So anyway, I'm wandering a bit here. I got sidetracked by Serenbe and community. Something took you from Kansas and then Dallas 2011, and you've been there ever since. Tell me a bit about that journey.
Sure, yeah. Went to school at Kansas State, and was fortunate that they were doing a 5-year master's program. So was just able to get that degree in 5 years. And then the economy was not so favorable when we graduated in 2010. I think out of
Yeah.
75 classmates, I had 4 or 5 that had jobs after graduation. The rest of us, had to figure stuff out and do something else. So I was fortunate to be able to get hired on to teach that following year at K-State. So I was able to still stay engaged with architecture and basically have a year of decompression after 5 years of intense architecture school. It was quite nice.
Yeah.
So I stayed there and did that, and then they asked me to stay on teaching, and I thought that would be so fun, so fantastic. I really enjoy it. It's flexible. The time commitment's great. I didn't really need a lot of money then, but I realized, I definitely respected my teachers that could show us built projects that they had done and worked on. So I wanted to know, how to do a building, go out and get experience and work. So, I declined. And then my wife, who I met at school at K-State, who we were dating at the time, and she had gotten a job here in Dallas. And so after teaching, then I moved down to Dallas, just with the expectation, like I'll just do my best to find work, because there was
Yeah.
none in
Yeah. Well, that was the
Kansas City
GF,
area.
but it was also the GFC. I think I remember in the GFC, so 2009, 2010, they were selling houses in Texas for like $5 and $150 and stuff like that. And there were New Zealanders buying them up and Australians buying them up. And to this day, I met a builder here in Sunshine Coast, maybe about maybe about 7 or 8 years ago, who owned and he'd never been to Texas, and he owned something like a dozen houses there. And what he
Whoa.
had done was he'd bought them all for like, less than $500 each, and back in the GFC, and he had bought them through some agent. They'd done some repairs and stuff on them, and they were still his rental portfolio, and he'd still never been. Like,
Wow.
isn't that amazing? They just,
Yeah.
yeah, like
Pretty
incredible.
wild
And
that was a possibility.
I remember there were what do you call it, like organized meetings of people who were selling real estate in Texas. I can't remember what towns, but organized real estate. So I lived here on the Sunshine Coast, and there were organized groups going and doing purchasing of places during the GFC. Yeah. So I know architectural work was nothing at that time. Everybody's books, well, not everybody, but most people's books just dried up,
Yes, exactly. All the firms,
laid
laid a
off.
bunch of people off, and I was fortunate to arrive basically right at the moment that the firms were building back up and restaffing. So, I was one of the first group, few people that got hired at a firm called Callison, and big international retail and commercial firm, and then hired on a contract basis, because they're not ready
No
to commit
guarantees.
to full time just yet. After a year or so, they converted most of us to full time. But yeah, I was able to be part of a fun sort of growing group there, get some great experience. It was a really, really positive environment. Again, we had a great time. We were, felt supported, and it was a good place to start the career. So I was definitely thankful to, come down here and get that opportunity. So
100%.
spent a couple, close to 3 years there, and then went to a small boutique firm here in Dallas called Oglesby Green. It's sort of the legacy firm from Bud Oglesby, who was, again, back in the 60s through the 80s or so, one of the premier architects in Dallas, sort of a highly respected modernist practice and classic modernism, timeless design. So that was a great experience. Learned a ton from both principals there, Joe McCall and Graham Greene. And that's really the
Okay.
foundation of my experience that sort of led me to go out on my own.
And then going out on your own, did you take some clients with you? Did you have clients that, like, was it a scary proposition? What year did you go out on your own? What year did you set up Agent Architecture?
So 2017.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
And I was sort of took it as a badge of pride or whatever, that I did not take any clients. I never, like, there's no work from previous firms on our website. Everything is like completely our work. So yeah, was fortunate to have a client sort of come to us. I say us, my wife and I,
Yep.
although it was just me that started it for
Yep.
a few years before she joined. But they had come to us, and I knew that this project wasn't going to be a good fit for the firm I was at, but I wanted to do it.
Yep.
But my wife still had her job, so I knew that was sort of de-risking it a little bit. I
Yep.
wasn't going to end up on the street not making rent or anything. So So I just said, okay, I thought this was going to be like 10 years down the road, but I guess it's now. So here I
Yeah.
go.
Here you
And
go.
just being out and open for business led to
Hmm.
more work. So very soon, like relationships that I had just made organically through involvement in things that I was passionate about turned into project work without really thinking about it.
Yeah.
So I guess that's a huge plug for just like being involved and engaged in the community with things that you care about.
I think so. Being a voice or a pillar in that community where people understand it and recognize that that's what you do is, I was going to say, so you're, what is that, 7 years into your own business. What things, if you were going backwards in those 7 years, looking back over those 7 years, what things would you wish you'd known that you would tell somebody else who was about to do the same thing?
Well, a lot. So I did read a book at the beginning, and that sort of inspired me to know that this is possible. It's called Architect Entrepreneur, and
Yeah.
that was huge for me. That kind of demystified a lot of the nuts and bolts of how it might work. I think some of the most difficult things at the beginning were, and to an extent still are, like contracts and fees. But
Hmm.
architects in America can't talk about fees with each other, so
What do you
that
mean they
just
can't?
figure it out.
They can't or they won't?
They can't because of an antitrust
Oh,
ruling by the Justice Department in the Reagan era. So they they ruled that whatever the AIA was like publishing fee guidelines or something, that was price fixing and not allowed. So we're not allowed to talk about fees with each other. So you just got to guess. So that
this,
means I've wildly undercharged, undersold my services for a while. And then after a few projects where you're like, oh, this is not good, you figure it out. And so now, 7 years in, we
you've
feel
figured
pretty
it out.
confident in knowing what our time is worth.
What a really interesting thing. And I get on one side of the motivation of that is that they don't want price fixing across an industry. And that's good, because it means it's an open market economy at that point. But architectural schools also aren't teaching that element of entrepreneurship and giving guidelines.
That's very true. Yeah, I knew very little about, I mean, all fees sounded huge to me when I started, so like,
Until you
yeah,
actually had to pay money out.
yeah, and it's that feeling insecure about, oh, I don't want to scare these clients away because of my fees. So I feel like architects can have that sense a lot of just not being afraid of charging
Yeah,
what they're
they're
worth. I don't
worth.
know. I think there's probably some firms that charge a whole lot. I don't know, but
Unless you actually work in the fee department, you're not sure.
yeah, exactly. So I mean that was a big challenge, one
And
that I
so
feel like
what
we're
would you what would
overcoming.
you say to people? Read that book, Architect Entrepreneur would be a good book to start with.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
a great place. Yes. And then I don't know, you're just get comfortable with the idea that you're going to spend a lot of time that you wish you were designing reading contracts because you
exactly.
got to have those. And yeah, I don't know that those negotiations can sometimes be months
Hmm.
before you land a project.
Hmm.
So
I think that's another part. The simplicity of it goes
it's
away
just
pretty
one of the
quickly.
fun parts about it.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I think
Yes.
uh, there's a lot where people think that a lot of people, in their early days, just imagine themselves drawing something every day, and you suddenly realize that the management side of it and the actual amount of drawing side of it is quite different.
Yeah, it's so skewed for me now. I'd say less than half my time is drawing and design focused.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And how big a team do you have?
So it's myself, Sarah, my wife, and co-owner.
Uh-huh.
And then we have Simone Alvarez and Kristen Henry, and so there's four of us full time right now.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Which is a nice size. A lot of firms are about that size. There's a lot of 4 to 5 people firms.
That I mean, not in Dallas, I feel like. So like Dallas is a city of big corporate firms, which absolutely have their place and they do projects that we could never do. But Dallas didn't really have that culture of startup entrepreneurial sort of small firm. There's sort of the generation of sole practitioners that we all look up to that have sort of stayed small 1 to 2 man shops.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there are not a lot of people our age, of our size, sort of doing what we were doing. And I think since we've started, we've seen more people open their own shops, which I think is great, because I think there's a lot of room for that in Dallas, and I would like to see more of a culture of that in Dallas. I know Austin has a pretty good, like, small practice culture and scene, but Dallas was just totally different from that, at least 7 years ago.
Yeah, wow. Well, what a cool journey, though.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like Dallas is the perfect place to be doing what we're doing, because there's so much happening here, so much investment, and I mean, a lot of like vacant or underutilized land in and around the urban, and yeah, just a lot of possibility for a group like us. And we've sort of fallen into adaptive reuse, which, again, there's a lot of these older buildings in and around the downtown area that we're able to sort of sink our teeth into and
do great things with.
It's the goal.
Take me through that kind of thing of, the adaptive reuse. How's it driven? Is it driven by city planning generally, or is it driven by, the typical gentrification of the places? The artists move there because it's cheap. It gets vibrant. They service their own community a lot, and it becomes this vibrant place. A few other people discover it, and suddenly the city goes, oh, this is because it's usually close to downtown and little unused on the wrong side of the, sunset kind of thing. And all of a sudden there's that they go, well, you know what, we could change all those things to lofts, and some developer jumps in along with the city and says, right, we're going to make a walking mall out of that street, or we're going to do whatever. Tell me about that in Dallas.
Yeah, no, that's a real thing. Absolutely. And you as an architect, it's so, you just live in a paradox every day, because you're trained to understand the sort of social societal things going on, and when, like, gentrification happens, and care about that and be very compassionate and sympathetic about that. Yet professionally, we are just like agents of gentrification, coming in with the townhome infill development on the lot that used to house a single family, that couldn't afford it anymore. So it's not comfortable, and I don't know that anyone's like reconciled that. I will say, like, in our so the adaptive reuse projects that we have been, like, the pre-K that we did, it was in a vacant sort of former grocery store with a big empty parking lot in the middle of a neighborhood, sort of a magnet for graffiti, for people just doing donuts and burnouts in the parking lot. Just this
there was a community,
like,
there was a community using it. Yeah,
things were happening there. Yes. And then we're able to come in and dress up the building, make it this sort of fun, cute, inviting place, and then, like, bring a green space where there was the parking lot to make it a better place for the community. So, like, that's all the goal. And, like, the 1806 Greenville project, that the facade literally fell down, so we had to rebuild it. And so let's rebuild it. We didn't rebuild it how it was, because that was built at a time when the building was being used for something it's no longer used. So we're going to do something that's contextually appropriate, but that serves the building's current function as sort of retail and food and beverage lease space. So, we sort of picked up this subtle Art Deco minimal motif with some cool custom sconces, and, just a couple design moves, and that's all you need. And, it turned out pretty sharp.
Yeah.
So I don't know, that where we're able to sort of come in with these little moments that add to the variety, add to the I guess the activity of what's going on. We like
that. It fascinates me, like, like in any, I'm going to say town, any city, if you were to do a perimeter walk around, sort of like just the outer ring, not way out to the ring roads and things like that, but this outer ring of the downtown, there is always a neighborhood that's about to be gentrified. or is
Mhm.
just starting. And it just sort of cycles around, other than the premium ones that just stay as those premium ones. They seem to be in constant updating and becoming, like of this moment in a very consistent fashion. But then there's always one that's waiting for its turn. And in my experience here in Australia, it's always been that its turn is driven by having a council, or I want to say a council, I'm not sure what you call it, a city, where the city says we need that neighbor, there's enough pressure or enough, I don't know what it is, that neighborhood needs to be done. And so then they go, okay, where's our master plan? What are we putting down in there? Then how do we engage everything from there? And people love gentrified neighborhoods, I mean, the people who
Oh yeah.
start to move, or that get moved out because of them, don't love them. Certainly people love them as a place to go. And like you were saying, in Dallas, it's such a car city that to create walking spaces, really, walkable neighborhoods. And like you were saying there with, taking a car park and turning it into a green space and making community space. I think there's a real art and skill in getting people to, park somewhere, walk through, and find spaces at the same time, and fall in love with little moments of places, whether it be from coffee shops to park benches.
Yeah, it's all like nothing's ever just a building, it's part of the broader context that
Mm.
that it's in. And I mean, you're right, like some of these transformations of these areas can be city driven, like the 1806 Greenville project. Greenville became what it is now because the city decided, like, okay, we're going to rezone this area. We're going to put, like, you can't operate bars and clubs here without a special use permit. We're going to invest, I think that was like 1.8 or 1.9 million dollars in street improvements back in 2011 or 2012. And then just that relatively small amount of urban money or city
Mm.
money
Very small.
completely transformed that entire area. And like all of a sudden there's all these sidewalk cafes and spaces, utilizing this, what was a 4-lane road with head-in parking, that's now like really wide sidewalks on either side with trees and parallel spaces in 1 lane each way in traffic. So like, yeah, that was city driven and it had a huge impact. And like, I just think about what the city could do. You could do like 20 of those throughout the city
Uh-huh.
for not a whole lot in terms of city money.
Yeah.
Or we could spend $500 million on like one signature statement bridge that like is sort of a farce and isn't really actually holding up the main highway lanes anyway. So anyway, but that's where Dallas's priorities are.
I think every city struggles with that. I think
Yes, I'm sure.
yeah, like every city struggles with this thing of where the money should be spent and what do the citizens need. And then every budget within the city, there's somebody who's, going, that's my budget and this is how I think it should be spent. But I'm with you on the other side of it as well, where I go, how many neighborhoods like that could you create? And in creating them, then you create these pockets of community, a little like how neighborhoods developed probably back in the
Yeah,
1930s and stuff like that.
absolutely. When they had these natural little commercial hubs
Hmm.
throughout, and yeah, we could do this throughout the city, and then maybe relieve the pressure on some of these super high focus, like
Mm.
walkable areas that everyone wants to be at, that are super gentrified because there's so few of them.
And then
Uh,
everybody's driving in there to park somewhere.
exactly. Yes, walkability in Dallas doesn't it means you can drive there and then walk around a bit. Like
Yeah.
you're never walking there unless you're like one of the lucky people to like live within a few blocks. Yeah, it's such a skewed. It's just completely car centric, and I don't see any way that's going to change. But I think we can celebrate, at least in the near future.
Yeah.
But I think we can celebrate things that are moving in the right direction and projects that are uh, good examples to follow. And which, some of that's being done, and there are some good things that are happening in the city right now in terms of getting some meaningful zoning change realized. Parking reform is a discussion here to eliminate parking minimums citywide, and so that would like transform reform the city that would make it a much more humane place, that would make it a place for years, but it would sort of deprioritize the car just a little bit and allow people to build what parking they think is reasonable for their use instead of, you know, 3/4 of your lot being parking and 1/4 being building, which is what the
Yeah.
current regulations demand, basically.
If you take that parking away from those lots, obviously you can do a lot of different things when you take the parking away. How do you still give people access without a system?
So yeah, in an ideal world, we are also creating better bike infrastructure, better transit infrastructure, overhauling the bus system so it's more user friendly and
Hmm.
timely. But I think it has to start with deprioritizing the car
Hmm.
because it's just so much of our space is dictated by that, and that drives housing costs because they have to build garages
Hmm.
because you have to have one space per every bedroom,
Yeah.
even if it's in the urban area, yeah, depending on your zoning. But I mean, no parking is going to be removed because of this. You know, like Target's
No.
still going to have a big sea of parking in front of it because
I'd like to thank Stetson Hats Australia for providing my amazing collection of open road Stetson hats. Since 1865, John B. Stetson has been crafting legendary headwear, adorning the heads of Western icons like Annie Oakley and George Custer. The open road hat debuted in 1937, beloved by artists, outlaws, presidents alike. Its timeless style fits the setting from city streets to open plains. Whether in the cab of a truck or my trusty Mini Cooper, the open road is all style. If you think hats aren't for you, you just haven't found the right one yet. Discover yours at stetsonaustralia.com or stetson.com if you're in the USA. Thanks, Stetson, for your support. Please share your Stetson moment by emailing me your photo to talkdesign@gmail.com. Let's celebrate the timeless allure of Stetson together.
so,
Yeah.
and I'm sure financiers like banks will still probably want to see parking, some amount of parking, you know, to finance the development.
Yeah.
So other forces will be at play there. But you
Mm.
know, if we want Dallas to be a city that looks different in, you know, the future, that isn't just a bunch of 8-lane thoroughfares, then you have to make a change like this.
I think it's really interesting because as you said, unless you deprioritize one, there's no need to shift. That nothing changes. You can talk about it, you can do all these things, but nothing will change because we're such
Yeah,
creatures of habit and creatures of comfort. Why would you change something that we already know how to do and we're comfortable doing? And
exactly. It makes me think of good cities like Montreal that we spent some time in last summer, that you don't want to drive there. Like,
mhm,
it's easier to just get in the metro, walk around downtown. Even with we had our 1-year-old there. Like, it's so much better
mhm,
than trying to drive around and find a spot and all of that. So, and it makes for a much better experience in the urban
mhm,
setting.
mhm.
Like, I mean, even here we live just south of downtown, walking distance from downtown, and so I can like and just take these long urban walks and like go
Yep.
through all of downtown, up through uptown and down, and like, okay, a couple hours, but I covered like 7 or 8 miles and
Yeah.
saw a lot. Like, you
Yeah.
know, you feel so much more connected.
Yeah.
So that's
I,
just that's the way that I want to experience my city. And I wish
yeah.
that other people
Well,
could.
it's interesting, as a parallel to that, like where not last year, the year before, we went to Barcelona for a architectural conference, and in being in Barcelona, the last thing you'd want is a car.
Yeah,
Uh, you,
absolutely.
you wouldn't even know what to do with it or where to put it. And the fact is that you discover by walking, or trying to remember whether we used scooters there. I don't think we did. We used taxis a little bit and Ubers a little bit. I don't know that they have scooters. I don't remember. We certainly didn't use them. But yeah, just the city's too old, too tight, but not all of it. The outside area of it isn't. But yeah, a car would be let's say, like the last thing you would really want to own. And I
Yep.
certainly know that, in cities like London and things like that, Milan, you just don't drive into the city. There's huge taxes if you drive into the city, and parking is like extreme in cost and stuff like that. So they have, deprioritized the car in those spaces and made people
Yeah.
use the alternatives. But you have to have alternatives as well.
It's
Sense.
true. And, they
Yeah.
have good, Milan has great metro system built up.
Mhm.
And yeah,
Yeah.
so yes, I mean, I wish that Dallas and Texas and Sunbelt cities could be like that, but they're not, it's completely car centric, and
Mm.
it,
I,
again,
I
not going to change anytime soon, but
Yeah, I remember going back to when I first ever went to America and it was in that Los Angeles thing going, because Los Angeles, imagine trying to survive there without a car. I couldn't believe, the size of buildings, but in the size of a block of land, so between Street 1 and Street 2, how big the block was. And people said to me, well, it's down the street. And I'd be like, right, okay. And I'd go, so can I walk? And they'd be like, no, you can't walk. Can't walk. You've got to cross the 405 or you've got to do whatever. You can't walk. And I'd be like, well, how far is it? I'm thinking I'm a pretty good walk. And they're like, well, it's 8 miles. All right. That's why I can't walk. And I remember
okay.
a couple of times setting off for it to walk to somewhere and going, oh, am I there yet? There was no map as such. There was just a bunch of directions. I did it a few years back in Abu Dhabi and in brutal heat as well, like absolutely like 50 degrees. And I got off the plane and I went, I'm going to go for a walk. I'm actually going to go and discover something. And I was pretty good with the heat, drank a lot of water, but just that whole go and discover. And it is, again, because of the heat, I would say it's a car city. It's a place
Mhm.
where you get in the car and go, and it's all centric to that. And Australia's a lot like that as well. New Zealand, same but less. Yeah. Volumes of people make a difference as well. Tell me about your project, Skeletal Tower, because this is fascinating, with the walking, and you just tell me. I'm not going to pre-prompt it.
Sure. Well, we do a lot of real projects, and so it's nice to
Fantasy
give
projects.
ourselves the opportunity, yes, to fantasize, to throw some ideas out there in a way that's unconstrained. So that the Deep Ellum Skeletal Tower project just came about and thinking about this Deep Ellum neighborhood that is just east of downtown Dallas, that is sort of a hub for, or has been and still is to an extent, a hub for creativity, artists, music, food and beverage, bars, entertainment, tattoo shops. It's just this fun hodgepodge of stuff, and that's where I first lived when I moved to Dallas. And over the last 12, 13 years I've been here, it's undergone some changes. There's been like 3 high rises built in the neighborhood in that span of time, a few more like full block apartment developments that have come through
Mhm.
and replaced a bunch of sort of 1-story old brick buildings. So just sort of with this understanding that development is happening in Deep Ellum. There's a lot of pressure on it. It's a very desirable neighborhood. It's right next to downtown. And while the artists may no longer be there due to gentrification, like it's still kind of retains this like grittiness
Mhm.
and sense of acceptance, and like everybody belongs, and it's
Yeah.
still a unique place in Dallas.
I think that
Um,
sense of acceptance that there's a place for people, is a
yeah,
big shift in how those neighborhoods develop.
yes, it definitely feels special and unique in Dallas I mean, it's just so different from any other neighborhood. So it got us, I've spent a lot of time in that neighborhood. It's very, special to me and a lot of people. And so thinking about like, well, what would a development here that, like, okay, acknowledging the development pressures to go dense,
Yes.
what would that look like that is more anchored in and of the community? And so we came up with this concept of just creating sort of the skeleton of a tower, the framework, the structural framework, and then maybe each level, it's just all open air, and then you sell off like portions of each level, and then the buyer can come in and build whatever they want there. So maybe you zone different floors, like this is a residential floor, this is a commercial floor, and then you build your art gallery or your barber shop or your office space or your residence up
Not
there.
really a whole
And
lot different from if it was a streetscape, but it's a vertical streetscape.
yeah, exactly. And so
Yeah.
like you want it to look like a crazy hodgepodge of different textures and forms and
Mhm.
everything. That's more organic to the neighborhood as opposed to like a sort of monolithic architectural thing. And then because most towers in Dallas are sort of these hermetically sealed boxes where
Mhm.
the people that aren't living in or renting, the offices or the high rent condos or apartments don't have the opportunity to be up there and see that access to those views. And so we introduced this public pathway that wraps all the way up to a public space at the top and utilizes some sort of internal streets on these levels to just make it all open and accessible to the public. So now my challenge is to someone that can put this in a pro forma and make it work
Yeah,
financially. There's got to be someone out there that can do it. So
absolutely. What a
yeah,
great partnership it would make.
that's the idea. I know a little. I can do super simple financial, analyses like that, but that one's outside of my ability.
Yeah, side of
So
your wheelhouse on there. One
yeah.
of the things I love about the idea of it is that you eventually, like, you could go and buy a square footage of lot, although it might be, 4 stories in the air or 5 stories in the air, and
Mhm.
it will face north, south, east, west, whatever the orientation of the building is. And then you get to build out that space, maybe with, I suppose, some restrictions, as in, mechanical, some of the mechanics of the building, of how it takes water or sewage and things like that and treats those. But you get to build out this in a form that is what you want, but you've got a floor in the ceiling already, in place. And there's no reason why you wouldn't have a bicycle shop on the 6th floor,
There you
right
go.
next
I
to
agree.
an architect studio, like, or a coffee shop, and people would find their niche within the building as to where they want it to be, and having corridors that run through the building as well, creates natural breezeways and all those kinds of things. And you could have a massive education, I want to say program, not so much an education program, an education for the people who are going to come and purchase there, so that they discover what happens with a building and how, the wind will move around it, how to best position it, how to best create their space for, privacy, light, all these different things that would need to exist to make it really work, rather than just building a big box and saying, there you go, there's a big box. So should this project get built, where in it did you want to live?
Yeah, I was thinking about that. It's like, how about like maybe kind of midway up, facing downtown, of course.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, that would be awesome. But I mean, it is cool to think about like, okay, maybe certain levels would like organically turn into more of the like the design hub or the
Hmm.
the
The
barber
artist.
shop. I don't know.
Yeah.
It's fun to think about that. But yeah, so we had a lot of fun putting that together and then it won an AIA Dallas Design Award last summer. So that was
Uh-huh.
a cool, recognition.
What did the AIA like about it? What were their drivers to give you an award for it?
Sure. I think it was just the speculative sort of just throwing a weird idea out there, nature of it. That again, the culture of design in Dallas and of design awards particular. I've sat on the design awards committee for a few years and chaired it for one. And most design awards submissions for the unbuilt category, I will
Hmm.
say, don't gravitate towards this sort of theoretical project. It's more It's like, oh, here's our design for a cool house that we're going to build next year, or here's like
Yep.
a library that we're working on. So this, I think, stood out because of that. And then like no one else was submitting sort of pie in the sky, just like design explorations. So I think that definitely worked in our favor. So that's a challenge to Dallas architects to submit more just weird stuff to the Unbuilt Design Awards.
Sure. Well, outside of Dallas, to all architects, design the unbuilt design is a space of exploration. It's not necessarily has to be built, but making it practical enough that it can be built actually gives it legs in the sense
Yes.
of, and the backstory of the neighborhood and understanding how everything comes together to make that happen is part of the genius of it as well. And it's aspirational, like it gives people a new set of rules or a new set of opportunities to think around.
Yeah, I feel like Dallas and probably a lot of cities, are very governed by the status quo, and like the
Mm-hmm.
way of doing things is
Mm-hmm.
the way that people know, and like this is how we do these deals, and the real estate community is very sort of like celebrates any and all deals regardless of like, well, there's nothing really new or interesting going on here, but
Mm-hmm.
like, nope, it's a deal, so just good job
That's
everyone.
their
um
job. That's their job. Just
yeah,
get it done, get it sold.
yeah, so it's like, yes, that is just like desperate to like throw something different and new out there and like, yeah, let
Mm.
people think about it. So I think there needs to be a lot more of that in Dallas. I would love to see like a stronger culture of like imagining and yeah, visioning of like what could be.
Do it would be fascinating to your drawings of everything like that, and to almost like an art installation, hoard off like with a hoarding all around a lot that was sort of unused or whatever, and project that this was what was going to happen next on there, and have it open, like with I want to say like a conversation, a city conversation where people could object to the project or support the project. And you
Mhm.
could do this so easily with AI these days, in the sense of pretending it was happening and see what people thought of the project, and really dig to see whether how the people who want to keep it as it is down there, the people who are progressive and go, wow, I could imagine that, and just see what would happen. And people would think that it was probably going to be built, it was about to be built, and they had one last chance to either stop it or help it. Like it would be pretty
You would definitely
fascinating.
elicit some strong reactions with that. That would be pretty cool
It
to
would be
see.
really interesting, wouldn't it? Like, even if it was just not hoarded off, but it was done as, we're going to remove this part of this town and we're going to do this with that piece. And it was in the newspapers. Nobody was watching newspapers anymore. It was on the news maybe, and it was in some magazines, and it was, basically fictitious to create the conversation, just prodding the
Mm.
community to create conversation to see what matters.
That would be amazing. Could like send a press release to the real estate reporter or whatever and see what happens. It's brilliant, brilliant, and very subversive. I love it.
I think it would be fantastic. I think it would be so good. And because it would be controversial, and the opportunity for something to happen would be accelerated tenfold because of a conversation that would just be made public. And, the AIA Dallas would be backing it as well. Like, this has to happen because of these reasons, and that's why we awarded it. And da, 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 da,
Mm,
da.
I like it. It's a
Dream,
good, it's
dreaming
great
up
scenario.
something that people would be like, oh no, don't do that. It could, yeah. I think with a lot of neighborhoods, if people realize that just when the planning changes, the planning permissions, the planning structure over a neighborhood changes, that change is coming regardless. It's going to happen. And
Mhm.
I'm not saying everybody should have a voice in that change, because it just becomes too many voices. But once you get something where it is, can be modeled, can be done, all these things, then there is an opportunity for people to have a voice and take it a step further, especially when you can project how it changes living, how it changes how people live. I think that makes a big difference.
Yeah, just having something visually to react to is helpful for people.
Yeah, 100%.
It's not abstract, but
yeah, absolutely. So tell me, with your practice, what do you see in the next, like the landscape of design looking like in the next 10 years?
It's a good question. So what I'm seeing and what we're hearing in the real estate world, obviously office, everyone's talking about office and what's going to happen with office. People aren't coming back like we thought they would. Office needs have shrunk. We have all these vacant office buildings. Yeah, there we go. Perfect. Problem solved. I love it. I mean, we do a decent amount of workplace. We have, we're an interiors and an architecture practice. So we do a decent amount of work is purely interiors, finish outs of workspace. And a lot of our adaptive reuse has been, converting from industrial use to office space. And so I think a lot of it's going to be, I think the future is more adaptive reuse because of construction costs and hopefully a higher sensibility on sustainability and resource use. And existing buildings are the most sustainable buildings because they're there. So let's utilize those. So many of them will make great buildings for future uses. Whereas I think there is a mentality in Dallas of too quick to tear down. Some things are old and were never special and need to go, whatever, that's fine. But every time I drive around, there's another old building that's just gone now. And it's just sneakily happening and no one is
It's
doing
not a
anything
community decision. It's just a decision that's made.
Yeah, and these buildings get torn down and then they just stay empty. Like the lot just stays vacant for years. And it's like, okay, well, what was that for?
That always amazes me, like unless a building is uninhabitable, that does amaze me, how you see empty lots. I live in a small beach area north of Brisbane, and there's a corner on one of our main roads that runs across the front of the beach. And so this main road runs down. There's a big green space on the other side of the main road. And then the other side is apartment blocks. And, generally under each apartment block, there's some shops and a restaurant and things like that. And then there is this one particular corner, and I've lived here for 24 years, basically, and it has had a car yard on it, and I think that's all I've ever seen there, and it is still vacant, and it's probably been vacant for, goodness, I would say a good 12 years or something like that nothing's been built on it. And it's built out past it, and it's built out the other way, and I've never looked to see why either. I've never gone and looked in council or anything like that, but this is a valuable piece of land that from about the third floor you would have, or even the second floor, you would have sea views, and yet it's just an asphalted and concreted kind of space.
Yeah, I don't get it. It happens in my neighborhood a lot. There's a lot of empty land that is just sitting there. So it's not for sale. There's no development plans. It's just sitting there. I'm not going to pretend to understand how that is tenable for people, but I guess it is. And it holds the neighborhood back. It keeps it from becoming what it could be. So I think it's a problem.
Even to the point where it isn't turned into some park or a usage space, when there's vacant lots, whether the city would go, yeah, well, great, we'll put in, somebody owns it, and the city goes, so what's your development plan on it? And they go, oh, we're land banking it or whatever. We don't have a development plan for it currently. And then they go, okay, cool, well, we'll put take on the liability of it, of the space, and instead of it just being a vacant lot, we'll put some trees and some whatever and whatever on there because you're not using it, but that means that community can use it in the meantime. In London, and I don't know whether this story's true, So, but it's my story, so it's true from my point of view. But I was told years ago when I lived in London that there's all these little green spaces between buildings and things, and they were from the plague. They were burial spots from the plague. So they're not actually graveyards as such. They were mass at some point, but they've been left as these little, and they're still little green spots, but they are often, beautifully little curated parks, but one lot big kind of thing. And again, the whole piece about the plague is the piece I'm unsure about. But like when you're in London, you do find these little spots, not just big planned gardens, there's plenty of them as well, but little, 1 or 2 lot spots that you go, wow, it's just a green space that's in the town. And there must be some sort of agreement or ordinance, or maybe the city owns them all. I don't know. And Barcelona, there was down old Barcelona, there was a mayor, I want to say, anyway, somebody who ran the city, who back, I think it was around maybe the 70s or 80s, identified a whole lot of old buildings that were in such disrepair that they were a hazard. They were sitting empty, and we'll say beyond repair. And so they identified these buildings and they removed them, which was, people go, oh my God, they removed these buildings. And they're in dense little streets. Now, each of those, you call them courtyards. And because nothing was built on a square grid, in the old town, there you'll have these beautiful triangular spaces filled with trees, and then there'll be some cafes and some shops that open up, and it's like a little village center, but there were buildings on them. They were built out spaces, and they got removed. And like in Barcelona also, the waterfront was, if you were ever there pre the Olympics, you couldn't see the waterfront. The waterfront was all warehouses. Everything was blocked off. The beaches existed behind these buildings. And when the Olympics when they got their Olympic, they removed all those buildings and then reinstated all the beaches. And it made the old town engage with the waterfront again, which it must have done at some point. But really interesting, a bit controversial as well. And when you're talking about how these things develop, somebody puts a priority over those things. And apparently this mayor or whoever he was that made this decision that these buildings would be removed, that was very controversial at the time.
But yeah, now you can imagine Barcelona with a bunch of industrial buildings on the waterfront. So so that's amazing.
Can't imagine it any other way. I've got a couple of last questions for you. One is your favorite space in your own home and what emotions it evokes.
Well, I'll live in a sub 1,000 square foot studio loft, so that's just that space. But
then let's go place in that space.
Okay. So we have in our living area a big garage door with, it's glazed, and then so when it's nice, you can just open that up and it just opens out onto our little patio area. And so I really appreciate that about the place, that we can have that sort of indoor outdoor connection and just like sit on the couch, but like your arms outside and you're
having the window down in the car.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, definitely appreciate that. Yeah, and it's a condo that was built in like 2006, so it's modern, simple, minimal, so appreciate that as well. And when we came in, we sort of stripped it of all things that previous owners had added and just like returned it to its just basic sort of white box wood floor.
Yeah, right.
So
that's cool. And then the other one would be one last project. There's nothing more to be done from this project on. You can't do any more. This is it. Last one. Can't direct anybody else to do your work. It's over. What do you choose?
that's great. I want to design like a dog trot house. I think Glenn Murcutt does stuff like that, right? So, that was the vernacular in Texas, and it's sort of climatically adapted, and you take advantage of the prevailing winds. You have a shaded space. You have high ceilings so that you can do some of that stacked ventilation and get the heat up there above where you're at. And we don't build that way anymore to, responsibly with our climate, because we rely on the air conditioning box. So I want to design a dog trot house that's sort of very handmade, like whether that's stucco, plaster. So we went to a monastery in New Mexico for a few days just to get away, and New Mexico is amazing, just like the building materials out there with the adobe, and
Yep.
sure, it's a bit of a novelty for me being from Texas, but it's just these buildings, they feel so connected to the human like experience and scale, because it's like you can see the hand that like made this wall of plaster.
Yeah.
And it feels like it belongs to the land. It's the same color as the dirt around it. It just, I don't know. I want to figure out how to do something like that in this context.
I love it. I love it. The dog trot, it put a smile to my face because it's such a Texas thing and it makes so much sense in how it works. And on one of the TSA conferences, I went to a dog trot that Mark Whalen had done.
Oh, cool.
Down in the Texas Hill Country, but a super modern dog trot and sort of a semi-agrarian style building, very unexpected. And I remember it so vividly and enjoying the building. Like when I first saw it, I'm going, what is this thing, But it actually has a big dog trot. It's a two-story building with a dog trot. And my first ever, I'd never heard of a dog trot before, obviously not being from Texas. Anyway, Charles Dupin, architect from Austin, a French architect that lives in Austin, and he had a dog trot that he was putting on the AIA Open Homes Tour. And he said it was a dog trot. And I'm like, a what trot? Like, what are you talking about? And then there's parallels to it, to what we have in Queensland. Like we have what were Victorian houses, or we call them queens. And often they had a central hallway, like a shotgun, central hallway, and then rooms off either side of that central hallway. That's how they were built. They were always built on stilts so the air could run underneath them. And that would give natural ventilation. They had wide floorboards, so those would shrink, and that would allow natural ventilation as well into the building. They had very high ceilings. Not that I think they planned that the floorboards would shrink, but that's what happened. And they would often have big return verandas around all sides of the house, maybe sometimes blocking our western side, because that's our hottest side. And people would sleep out on those verandas, when it was too hot to be inside, they'd sleep on the veranda. So you'd choose the side that, in our case, you'd choose probably the south or the western side where the sun wasn't going to come up on it, and you'd sleep there. Western side, you'd have a lot of radiant heat still held in the building still, but just they were single skin buildings with usually the framing showing on the outside, and then they were clad on the inside of that, and just really utilitarian to do a job. And yet we don't build them that way anymore. And the dogs lived underneath the house. They would live in the shade and the dirt underneath rather than through a dog trot. And a dog trot creates a breeze between it as well. So it just creates that breeze wave, the heat and the heat and the cool, and it just sucks air. So yeah, I'm a big fan of like, what is that original architecture? What worked? And what are we giving up when we plug in the air conditioner?
Absolutely. I mean, even just having a home that gets good cross ventilation, like means you can drastically reduce the number of days that you need to turn on the AC if you're willing to do that. So
my family, we live without AC in a house that we didn't design. We've altered it a lot. But when I came here, being a New Zealander, and I actually came here from England, I couldn't believe we had 330 sunshine days a year. We were living in a subtropical climate, so it gets humid and sticky during the summer. And I'm like, well, if this is where we live, why would we have air conditioning? The temperature range isn't so high. We have a fireplace, which most of the time we have to open the doors if we use it. but it's a lovely romantic thing to have.
Yeah.
But otherwise, yeah, we removed the air conditioning from the house and we put some cross ventilation and some roof venting, and we live with our doors open more than 9 months of the year. They don't even get closed.
Oh, that's amazing.
We'll get birds and bugs that come in with them as well, but like and we get, hot days. Like we get really hot days. Not as dry, brutal as Dallas. It's a bit more Austin style with the humidity, that Austin has that high level of humidity. But my family's never lived with air conditioning because there isn't any to live with.
That's amazing. Yeah. What a different, way of life.
And every home that I design, I try to make the air conditioning redundant. They'll still put it in. They'll still put it in. But then I go, if we can live without it, let's make the house live without it. You just spend your money, but don't use it. But it's Andrew, fascinating chat, man. I've really enjoyed this. And people who are going into their own practice, agent, architect, entrepreneur, there's a book. And I think it's a really good tip to understand that there's a business and there's a set of drawings that get done as well, and the envisaging of projects. But the business side of it is part of what makes it really tick. And fascinating to know that you're not allowed to discuss fees. I don't even know whether that's the same in Australia, but people's fees do tend to be a very closely guarded secret. And I'm a part of a few big architectural communities around the world. And funny, just the other day, I had that discussion where I said, well, what percentage are you charging on this project? Or what percentage are you doing on this? And they'd be saying, oh, well, that one there's 9%, is the project, is our fees on that project, about 9% of the build cost. And I'm like, well, how's that broken up? Like what part goes where? But I never considered that they're not actually really allowed to discuss that. And they're not discussing it anyway. They're just telling me what it is because I'm asking the question. I'm going to say, on that project, what kind of fees could you take on that? And they're telling me, and then they'll show me, their construction drawings and stuff like that. I go, oh, okay. So, how many hours were in those? And it's fascinating to do this around the world and get a real read on what things are, because fees are fees. At the end of the day, you get to keep a portion of them, and the rest of them, go in running costs and reinvestment and all these other things. There's only a portion of them that you get to keep at the other end of it. And that isn't directly related to what percentage it is in fees. Yeah, a whole lot of other things that make the difference. So yeah, that was interesting, really interesting. And I'm with you, all for more walkability and gentrified neighborhoods, but with a conscious mind.
Yeah, Dallas is experimenting with tools to allow existing residents to be able to stay, in the neighborhoods as they begin to gentrify. So, that is encouraging. There is work being done on that front. So, yeah, I think it's just being aware and just trying to be thoughtful about that as an architect with the projects you take on, and just with the types of clients that you. I
think that's great. Andrew, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. And
I enjoyed it.
We'll post all your socials, etc., and people will be able to find you. And if you love this podcast, please subscribe. And also, if you've loved what Andrew's had to say, reach out, get him to look at your project next.
Hey, not a bad idea.
Cheers, man. Take care.
Thanks so much.
All right. Okay, bye. Thank you for tuning into our conversation. I hope it left you both informed and inspired. Don't forget to subscribe wherever you listen. And please don't hesitate to share your design thoughts with me. It's always a joy to hear from you. If you're like me and crave a deeper dive into design thinking, coupled with a love for travel and adventure, consider one of my architectural adventures. Join me and some of my wonderful design friends and embark on a journey of a lifetime. Apply for an unforgettable design experience at adrianramsey.com. With our clients spanning the globe, I firmly believe behind every great project are great people. If you're a great person and seeking to turn your dream into a reality, I'd be honored to design your home with you. Why not join the ranks of our exceptional clients and let's make your heart sing? Reach out to me at studio@ardesignhouse.com. That's studio@ardesignhouse.com, and let's get a conversation going and make your heart sing.